Good evening, everyone. My name is Dan, and on behalf of Book Soup, I'd like to thank everyone for joining us for our virtual event with Scott Meslow in conversation with Kerensa Cadenas, discussing From Hollywood with Love, the rise and fall and rise again of the romantic comedy. For regular updates on upcoming events, please feel free to subscribe to our email newsletter. This evening's virtual event will end with a Q&A. To submit a question, please use the Ask a Question button at the bottom of the screen. If you see a question on the list that you'd like for our speakers to answer, please click the like button, and we will try to answer as many questions as time will allow. Also, please consider supporting our bookstore and the author's work by purchasing a copy of today's featured book. Just click on the green Purchase button directly below the viewer screen. The link will redirect to our website where you can continue the checkout process. And I want to say quickly that for the first 10 people to make a purchase of the book tonight, you get a free poster, limited edition poster, with some images from classic films that are featured in the book. So you'll want to do that soon at the link in the center of the screen. And now a few words about our featured guests. Kerensa Cadenas is a Brooklyn-based editor and writer. She's currently the editorial director of entertainment at Thrillist. Before that, she worked at The Cut, Entertainment Weekly, Vanity Fair, Cosmopolitan, and Complex. She's usually squawking about Harry Styles, but I think it's Harry Styles' birthday today.
It is. That's why I'm wearing pearls.
That's amazing. Depressed lady protagonist and her perfect cat, Cricket. She's in conversation with Scott. Scott Meslow is a senior editor at The Week magazine and a writer and critic for publications including GQ, New York Magazine, and The Atlantic. He enjoys watching romantic comedies with his wife, their daughter, and a dog they named after Mads Mikkelsen. This is his first book. Congratulations, Scott, on your first book. And without further ado, I'm going to turn the cameras over to Scott and Kerensa. So sit back, relax, and enjoy the presentation.
Thank you.
Hey, Scott.
Kerensa.
So, Scott, you wrote a book. How are you doing? And it came out on Harry Styles' birthday. What a blessed day.
That was my real goal, yes. That was my first demand of my publisher.
Yeah, you're like, I have to celebrate Harry.
Whatever else we do, it has to be Harry Styles' birthday.
I mean, I think I appreciate that, and I know you did that for me.
Yeah.
So, you know, Scott, like rom-coms, like what a huge genre of stuff, you know, like why is it something you've connected with? Have you always been a fan? Like, why was this the topic you wanted to write about for your first book?
Yeah, I mean, I have always been a fan. I love rom-coms in general, and especially when you're thinking about spending a couple of years of your life really digging into something. It was like, why don't I pick a bunch of movies that I can watch on repeat endlessly that always put me in a good mood? It was exciting on a level of just, this is not something I'm going to get tired of. But there was also it felt like there was kind of, you know, as a critic, you're always kind of looking for ground that hasn't really been excavated yet. And for me, at least, I just felt like there are so many great rom-coms, especially of this era, because the book covers, you know, 89 to 2019, these beloved movies that really haven't gotten their due, that were often very underestimated at the time they were released, very snobbishly dismissed by awards, by critics. So I just knew there were a lot of stories that probably hadn't been told. And when I was thinking about people I might want to interview, it came down to who would be so excited to tell stories about the movies that they worked on that no one has ever heard before. And fortunately, I was able to get a lot of those.
Yeah, I mean, that's incredible. I can't imagine writing a book because like I can barely write like a blurb anymore. So was that something that was kind of like nerve-wracking? I mean, it feels like a big undertaking. You know, what was kind of your process going into this?
It really helped kind of figuring out, that I wanted to cover this 30-year period specifically. And once I knew the starting point was going to be When Harry Met Sally, which to me kind of set the tone for the modern era of rom-coms. There was a template that people were then able to follow. And so at that point, then it became less a problem of how am I going to fill a book than how am I going to winnow this book down? You know,
Yeah.
Everybody I talk to about the book inevitably says, but I can't believe you didn't include this movie. And every time they're right. You know, it's the writing process for me started with making a list of probably 70 or 80 movies, each of which totally deserved its own chapter. And eventually I just went, I can't write a 2,000 word book. And so so then you start to kind of go to what are the movies that both are interesting in themselves, but also represent something larger about the genre and what was happening at the time. And once I was able to pin that down, that's how we got to these 16.
Yeah. Was there stuff that you just were like, oh, I don't want to cut this, but like you had to? Do you have like any examples of anything?
Yeah,
that was really painful?
sure. There were, for a long time, the book had a chapter on teen rom-coms. It was gonna be Clueless and 10 Things I Hate About You in particular, and it was a mix of. It just felt like at that point I was going in a different direction that probably was more of a book. And then of course Jen Chaney, this a very great writer, had already published a book-length oral history of Clueless, and it was like, well, I'm not going to do more in a chapter than she did in a book. And so at some point it just became, this is a hard cut, but it does feel like a cut I need to make.
I would like to say I am quoted in that book.
As well, you should be.
Most of the people wore skirts at like an unhealthy age, probably. But but like obviously as a fan of the genre, how is it like reaching out and then getting to talk to some of the people that you got to talk to and get these like stories that maybe people haven't heard before? Who did you get to speak to that was kind of like, holy shit, I can't believe I'm talking to this person about this right now?
It kind of works on multiple levels, because on one level, like I could not be a bigger fan of Judy Greer, and I'm sure everyone who is paying attention to the rom-com book agrees with me, because she's in all of them and she's the best in all of them. And then when you really sit down and kind of talk to her about the movies she's been in, she is like, the way that those movies make you feel like you wish you were best friends with her, she really is that cool. So that on one level it was people like that, but on another level it's just, you find people like the hairdresser on There's Something About Mary, who I think had never been interviewed, but like, can you name a more iconic hairstyle? That scene in that movie, and was so excited to tell the story of the day they shot that. And so in some ways, those were, when you'd come up with a name, when you'd kind of be going through the weeds, or you'd be talking to someone and say, who you have to talk to, and they'd throw out a name that maybe wouldn't even have occurred to you. Those interviews often turned out to be the most rewarding.
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, one thing I love so much about the book is there's so many small details that, you're not going to like necessarily unearth in like an article or whatever, like learning about like, was it the Nancy Meyers rom-com that never got made, or like just all these small like little things? Were there tidbits that were really like delightful and shocking for you to find out while you were doing the research and talking to people?
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that one up, because that's kind of because this book is kind of covering the rise and fall and rise of the rom-com. At some point I needed a movie that kind of represented the fall. And it was really hard to come up with, here's the rom-com that meant rom-coms were gone. There are rom-coms, it's very insulting to the people who made it. And also, I don't really think it was much more complicated stuff, as I sort of get into in the book, happening at the studios that weren't even just about rom-coms. It was kind of about the decline of mid-budget movies. And
exactly.
What I discovered while I was excavating is there was this huge buzzy rom-com sold from the guys who wrote 500 Days of Summer right as the royal wedding,
I love that chapter.
William and Kate wedding was happening. And these guys sold a royal wedding rom-com, and Nancy Meyers then did a pass on the script and was going to direct. And it's like, can you imagine a more slam dunk rom-com premise?
No.
And it fell apart at Sony on budget problems, because they weren't convinced, they didn't want to invest the money that Nancy Meyers thought it would take to do kind of a royal, they described it as meet the royal parents. And again, that just, you can see it was a 7-figure pitch, and you can see why. But there was something weird happening at the studios at that point, where even stuff that there's no way that wouldn't have made money. It might not have made Avengers money, but it would have been a hit. And that was just not the movie. They pulled away from any movie that looked like that. So
yeah. Well, and I think that's so fascinating, because like, you look at like just general like royal hysteria now, like the Fug Girls books, like rom-com books are so wildly successful. There's been like 70 different Princess Diana things like happening in the last like several years. I think it seems crazy that that's not like something they wouldn't do. And do you think that's just like, I think like obviously that's been a talk, like things that come up is like talking about like IP and like how these mid-budget movies don't exist anymore, and like, and not to just point a finger at Marvel, but like
it's a representative example. But that's, I mean, we're getting to the end of the book, but that's where I think the streamers really stepped up, where, you know, Netflix, which of course has more data about what people are watching than any other place at any other time in human history. Smart people there went, look, we're putting up old rom-coms, and those movies are, you know, people are streaming them 7 times in a month. Why aren't we just making our own? There is money on the table that the studios are not taking. And you saw Netflix really go all in on rom-coms about 5 years ago. And clearly it's working because, you know, they're putting out another one every month.
Yeah. And I mean, maybe this is like getting too close to the like end of the book, but, you know, I'm wondering, like, what do you think, like streamers, like kind of investment in rom-coms are, you know, obviously, like you said, Netflix, I think has, like, I loved Set It Up, and I think like maybe some of the other stuff they've done is like maybe not the best. Like I love all the stories which you write about. But and then Hulu just had like several, like Palm Springs is fantastic. And I think like they have another one coming out soon. You know, what do you feel like? Do you feel like the streamers can invigorate the genre, especially like if they decide, like they could, like with Netflix, like they could put it in theaters if they like wanted to.
Totally. I think in some ways, I mean, I think unfortunately we're headed towards kind of an era where the theatrical experience will be for movies that are kind of billed as the theatrical experience underlined. I mean, it's Dune this year sold very successfully on that, you know, where they really said you have to see it in IMAX, the biggest screen possible with the biggest sound. And like, that was a big proportion of that box office. I think unfortunately, and COVID sort of accelerated this whole problem of what's happening with the theatrical experience. But I think people are less inclined to go to movies like rom-coms unless, I mean, but then again, at the same time, a bunch of studio rom-coms coming out this year. I think they're just kind of see it big rom-coms. You know, we have Marry Me with J-Lo coming next week, which is about her being the biggest pop star in the world. So
and Owen Wilson looking like an elderly lesbian. I have to put that out there.
Horrible double.
You know, but I mean, and well, like you have a whole chapter about Sandy. We're getting Sandy back in the rom-com game with Channing Tatum.
Like, and Brad Pitt. She gets to choose guys. It's
it's honestly wild that we hadn't fully got a Channing Tatum rom-com until this. Yeah. I'm very excited for that.
Agreed. And I think the studios are, I mean, you know, Marry Me isn't even J-Lo's only rom-com this year. She's got Chocolate Wedding this summer. Like, J-Lo is back into rom-coms. And
he really is.
Great news for all of us.
Yeah, well, and I'm wondering also, because like I know Kat Poirot is directing Marry Me, like, do you think like also, like I know, and we'll talk about this obviously more, do you think like streaming is going to at least allow hopefully a bigger breadth of stuff, like we see that with Happiest Season, like, and like you to get into in the book, like diversity in terms of rom-coms is still literally not where it should be, as you could probably say for all of the industry in general. Do you think that maybe streaming is going to hopefully allow different kinds of voices and different kinds of like stories to be told in the genre?
It certainly seems like that's happening. I mean, it's both at the studios and streaming, like it's not happening fast enough or completely enough. But I think it's more like the studios are like these big old ocean liners and they just turn very slowly. But I think they are in turn. But the streamers are just a little lighter on their feet. I mean, the people I interviewed, Netflix is very hard to get people on the record, but people who've made movies for Netflix talk about how, I mean, they'll get a script, they'll greenlight it that week, it'll be in production in a month with Emma Roberts starring. Like they are really, you know, they have a system, and when they're ready for something to go into production, they will gun it out. And so I think that's part of why you're seeing the long overdue diversity stuff just happen faster at the streamers. It's because they're literally in production faster.
Yeah. Well, and I guess like one thing kind of going back is I think one thing, you know, you think about when there isn't necessarily like a full, like as you're kind of going through researching this, is like, how is it seen kind of like, you know, obviously as a fan of the genre, you kind of see it in bits and pieces, but then you're finally putting the history together. Like, and one thing I really loved about the book is I feel like the structure of the book really does sort of echo a lot, like very similarly, like kind of the whole idea of the rom-com, like, it's like a meet cute. It's like something that happens by luck and chance and happenstance. And that's the same thing that happened for so many of these films. Like, I mean, the Pretty Woman chapter is insane. Like, it's insane. And it is insane to think about like half of my notes in the book were like, this movie would never be made today. And not just necessarily because it's a mid-budget movie either. How is it putting those pieces together and kind of seeing the overall arc of it and how it's sort of related to essentially the plot of a lot of these films?
Yeah, that was a fun part about kind of figuring out which movies I was covering and then the structure of the book, because what I really wanted for the book was to be a history of the individual movies, but also a history of the genre and kind of moving in broader currents. And doing that, you just kind of realize I'm far from the first person to note that, like, it's crazy that any movie ever gets made, ever, let alone that movies are sometimes good. Like, it takes so many insane serendipitous things to get the right script and the director who doesn't screw it up and the stars who can pull it off and the marketing that makes sure it gets in front of the right people and, audiences being, kind of tuning into what a movie is doing. Like, so for all of these movies to sort of go through a process like that, and you're right that I have a chapter on Pretty Woman, and that's probably the craziest story in the book. Just in terms of someone writing a really kind of grim and gritty, out of the Sundance labs, like a really dark story about a prostitute and this billionaire who abuses her and then throws her out, and then Touchstone gets a hold of it, and suddenly Disney quite literally turns it into a fairy tale. And it is a movie that could only have existed after this insane, complicated development process, and it's this huge hit. And 100 times out of 100, you could not have pitched the final cut of that movie, even in '92, and had anyone sign up for it. Like, it really, and it's this huge crowd-pleasing movie, but it would never have sold then or now, or ever.
Yeah. I mean, watch, we're gonna get like a gritty remake of Pretty Woman, and it'll be that original script. I probably just shouldn't even put that into the ether, unfortunately. But well, and I thought that about a lot of like reading the book. Like Waiting to Exhale is one of my favorites, and also I was so glad you talked about the soundtrack, because like Impeachable, it's perfect.
Babyface, best.
Oh yeah, but so like I was, and maybe I'm just like overly cynical, but like I can't imagine Waiting to Exhale getting made today, and I know that that's just because like it just seems like impossible, and especially in a genre that is still so like so white and so and so straight. And I think like it's just interesting to think that some of these things like wouldn't be made today that have like been such weird, like huge influences in some ways, but still are like unfortunately still like the pillar and the one thing that exists. Is that something that you thought about and talked to people about while you were doing this?
For sure. I think Waiting to Exhale is an interesting example of that, because on one level, like, it was based on a book that was such a huge hit for Terry McMillan that like even Hollywood couldn't really ignore it. Like, I do think that would get made, but not because they're smart enough to realize that it's just a great story. I think it would get made because it is so clearly going to be profitable, and it was. But that's one where right now in development, they're working on a TV show sequel to it. And it's like that, I wonder, and Terry McMillan did write a sequel to the book many years later, Getting to Happy. And I do wonder if, like, as everything kind of becomes a franchise, that's the sort of thing where I go, I wonder how far Hollywood's going to take that part of the story.
That's something that you kind of like delve into too, is that like with Bridget Jones's Baby, which is not very good, and even with like My Big Fat Greek Wedding, talking about the TV show version, and we know like we live now kind of in a movie landscape where it's like sequel, spin-off. Like, do you think that's something that's going to happen to the genre, or like even something that it's like going back to like, do we get a Pretty Woman 2 now, or the Waiting to Exhale show, or like whatever?
My sense is that like the real classics, it's just too hard to make a sequel, and so what they're doing instead is making Broadway musicals. Like they did When Harry Met Sally on stage. There's a Pretty Woman musical. There's Something About Mary. He has a musical in development right now for aiming at Broadway. Like, most of those movies, a lot of them, they even tried to make sequels. I get into that with There's Something About Mary. There were just a bunch of bad sequel ideas that no one wanted to make, but 20th Century Fox really wanted it to happen. But I do think as we get closer and closer to the present in the book, sequels just become a lot more common, because that's what was happening with every genre. And I think for rom-coms, I'm actually kind of bullish on, like, I think it does interesting stuff to the genre. I think in some ways to kind of force writers to not just say, and they got together happily ever after, can lead to cool movies. It's part of why I write about and why I like the To All the Boys I've Loved Before movies so much. Where I love that first movie, but I also love that the second two movies make that relationship like weird and complicated and sort of force those characters down roads that you could never have done in a single movie.
Yeah.
I'm skeptical that they're now making a TV show spinoff about her little sister. I think there is, at some point, these stories do need to end, but I'm intrigued when it's not just one movie.
Yeah, but I would argue with you is that those are based on books that
Yes.
were written. And I think like a lot of these, whatever sequels that could come out, like maybe although I think that the girl who plays Kitty is a star, but
don't get me wrong.
Right. But you know, I think like a lot of these wouldn't necessarily come from like
right
material that necessarily, because like and like a lot of that like you get into in the book of some people's different ideas that they're like, well, I have this idea, but that wasn't going to work or whatever. And so I think like, I don't know, I would be afraid, like I don't want to see My Best Friend's Wedding sequel.
Yeah, well, that's something they're still trying to make happen. It was almost a TV show. I think when you get to the older stuff, there is something that feels a little. It doesn't feel like there's necessarily more story there because it wasn't made for more story. And maybe that is the difference. Maybe if you go in with a little more of a plan, but you know, Bridget Jones, they just decided to just get mad about the boy and do Bridget Jones's Baby instead. That's not directly based on. It was based on Helen Fielding's idea. It wasn't based on a book. They just didn't want to do it without Colin Firth, and who can blame them?
Yeah. When you talk a little bit like in the intro and kind of conclusion that, you know, just in the ways that you think like, you know, people are drawn to the genre, you know, I kind of, and now I'm like rethinking my note about this, of course, like in real time is like, do you think that we're drawn to them because they're formulaic, but it's sometimes I think the ones that I'm drawn to, like My Best Friend's Wedding or Bridget Jones, is because of the opposite of that. And, you know, what are your thoughts about why are you drawn to the genre, and why do you think like it's something that, you know, even if it's not necessarily popular anymore, I think it's still something like you're hungover and Sleepless in Seattle's on TNT, like of course you're gonna watch it, you know.
Yeah. I do think the crowd pleasing thing is a part of it. That they are just fundamentally movies that feel good to watch. There are movies I love that don't feel good to watch, and I don't want to watch them as much as I want to watch When Harry Met Sally. I just, you know, that's a movie I will watch 100 more times in my life. Even though writing a book made me a little tired of it, I still. But I think the formulaic stuff that you're talking about is durable for a reason. There's a reason that this literally goes back to Shakespeare. Like, you know, the rom-com structure is so satisfying just at a fundamental level. And the experience of love is a pretty universal experience. It's a thing that I think Richard Curtis has a great quote about, you know, kind of people always giving him such a hard time for these unrealistic, cartoony love stories he does. And he's like, people fall in love all the time, every day, on every corner. But if you write these really kind of dark sci-fi things, nobody talks about how unrealistic that is. Like people sort of run towards the darkness as the default mode and don't. There's something about kind of embracing the lightness of rom-coms. To which I would say the other thing is when people are kind of dismissive about it and, you know, call them guilty pleasures, or it's like, audiences aren't stupid. They're aware of the tropes. They're just not afraid to indulge in them. And that's totally like, that's part of why we go to cinema. There's an escapist element to it that is, you can do that with your eyes wide open, and that's a totally valid way to watch a movie.
Yeah. Do you think that Richard Curtis is the Kevin Bacon of rom-coms? Because that was something I thought of while I was reading the book.
I'm going to need you to unpack that.
Like 7 Degrees of Kevin Bacon. Like, because I was like, because he's like, is like connected to Helen Fielding. Yep. Like somehow he has his fucking hand in everything. And I was like, I think that Richard Curtis is the Kevin Bacon of rom-coms.
I think he certainly spiderwebs his way around. And if you were making a rom-com and you could get Richard Curtis to do a pass on it, wouldn't you?
Yeah, of course.
Has he ever made a rom-com that wasn't a huge hit?
No, and even if they're not, they're still like beloved. I cried outside the Grove like after About Time. Like,
I love About Time. I do think that's another story that I really loved getting into and couldn't get all of the details I would have loved, but that he dated Helen Fielding in college to me is just so sublime. Helen Fielding, who wrote Bridget Jones, for those of you who don't know that name off the top of your head, that these two kind of rom-com luminaries and still like are friends and send each other scripts and stuff. That's just what a rom-com relationship in itself. That's so interesting.
Seriously. Could you imagine like those love letters?
Oh, fascinating.
I think we have your next project.
Somebody should publish. Yeah, I would be so delighted. I would pour over them.
Well, I mean, and one thing like kind of like I guess like sort of goes into streaming and stuff is like, you know, and kind of goes into like the like idea of sequels is how do you see TV kind of playing and telling like rom-coms, because I do think like we're getting that like more and more. Like, I mean, obviously we were talking about How I Met Your Father earlier.
Yep.
You know, I think like there's I think that it seems like there is a lot of like kind of like the genre in television now anymore. And how do you feel about that? And because I mean, I think it is interesting because it obviously tells the story in a much different way.
Yeah. And I think that's part of why I think that death of the rom-com narrative that set in was kind of a misnomer, in part because at the same time that was happening, it was like, that was when How I Met Your Mother was huge. That was like Jim and Pam being like the defining, you know, will they, won't they couple of that era. Like people really were interested in love stories. There was just a lot more happening on TV than on film. But I also think when you look at what rom-coms have done on TV, like that's where a lot of the good deconstruction started. I don't think you can have a great conversation about rom-coms without mentioning Crazy Ex-Girlfriend and how completely that movie dug into rom-coms while kind of playing into the tropes, but also interrogating them, while looking at someone who built her life around rom-com tropes and eventually realized that was an unhealthy approach. Like it was such kind of a full-throated examination of the genre. I think there was just cool stuff happening on TV. It was a different book. In the end, my book is From Hollywood with Love, and that was focused on the Hollywood studios. And so the studios producing films specifically. But I would love to read like a parallel book about love stories on TV at the time. So someone please write that, because I will buy it the day it comes out.
Yeah, I mean, you get into that like a little bit when you talk about like when you have the chapter about Mindy Kaling, who obviously is a scholar of the genre, you know. Are there things that you've watched on television, like in terms of rom-coms, that are like things that you think that people should check out?
Yeah, I was really bummed when Hulu canceled High Fidelity after a season.
I loved High Fidelity.
And just like such a smart way to update that story, to do it, both to do it episodically and to change the race and gender of the main character and kind of explore all of like how dating has changed even since they made that movie in 2000, High Fidelity with John Cusack. I thought that was so smart, and I really thought it deserved another run. So certainly if you're looking for like a good TV rom-com, that's one I would say, even though you're going to want more when you're done with it, that's worth picking up.
Yeah. Do you think like that like the way that TV and film, like I'm thinking about specifically the chapter where you talk about Friends with Benefits and No Strings Attached, was obviously this time where they were trying to like change, like you talk a lot about change the rom-com to like fix with modern dating tropes. And I do like both of those films, but I don't think that they necessarily successfully do that.
Yeah.
Do you think like, but I think like High Fidelity does, and I think a lot of other like television rom-coms do. Do you think that's just in general because like maybe it's just like easier in terms of like being in the moment for it, in terms of like production and all of that, or maybe it just wasn't the right time for them to do it again? Because I do think that was in that weird era of like pre-Tinder being like taking over and, you know, whatever.
For sure.
Yeah.
I just think TV in general was and kind of is just a little more daring and pushing it a little farther. But I'm glad you bring up those movies, because that to me, that was such a fun, interesting chapter to dig into. No Strings Attached and Friends with Benefits, because it was just like, there was this era where Hollywood was like, we're going to get into how the kids are dating, and we're really going to So there was like this earnestness that was just so clearly like they were not quite up to the task of really doing that. And so like, and I also like both of those movies, but like they're very conventional rom-coms that you know, they kind of tease like, oh, what if you had a casual relationship? And then of course, inevitably the answer is no, we should be in a monogamous relationship, and we should do in the same kind of thing that, you know, Harry and Sally were doing, or, you know, or for that matter, going back to like any rom-com. Like they're not really, Hollywood really wasn't really willing to go to a truly non-traditional relationship.
Yeah, I mean, if they really wanted to have like actual representation, neither of those men would have a bed frame.
Right.
And, I think that's, I mean, they don't.
I don't know. Justin Timberlake worked for GQ. I think he'd have been on the next level.
I'm just saying, I think that they needed to talk to some real people.
Yeah.
about both of those.
Right.
Okay, wait, let's see. Okay, another thing that I thought was super interesting that kept coming up is I keep thinking about the Julia Roberts part about how she was like one of the only actresses who didn't have like refused to do nudity and had that like in her like general kind of like contracts. And then I thought it was like, and I know we're kind of like at this point, like you think about Free Britney and everything, where we're really obviously re-examining the ways that women were treated through like paparazzi, through media, whatever. But like there was a lot of stuff that comes up that I think in this that's very similar to like the way Julia Roberts was sort of talked about like during My Best Friend's Wedding, because it's such an anti-Julia Roberts role. All of the Nia Vardalos stuff is horrific.
Yes.
You know, was it, how is that kind of unearthing some of that? Because like it's like it sucks because it's like not surprising, but then you like see it and you're like, oh man, like this is just so icky and bad, especially because it sucks too, because I think like, and obviously sex it's always been framed as like a women's genre when that's not necessarily true. And that was like some stuff that I thought was interesting during with the Friends and Benefits and No Strings Attached. Like I don't want to hear Justin Timberlake say anything, but like when he was talking about like I want to make the guys laugh, and it's like, man, like this could just be for everybody. Like
yeah, all of that framing has just always been a bummer. I think digging into how women, in particular the women who made these movies, were treated, it's exactly right. It was very unsurprising. It was deeply depressing, and when you really, you know, when you're literally going through the paper archives of these, you know, these old magazines
and stuff,
and just like the stuff that ran normal mainstream, no one saying anything. I think there's been kind of a broad cultural examination of a bunch of Jay Leno monologues recently, and I think for good reason. Like the mainstream media stuff happening at the time was super cruel to women, frequently. And so I think hopefully what comes through in the book is like also these movies and the women who made them were super triumphant. Like, you know, Julia Roberts made I think My Best Friend's Wedding is a truly terrific romantic comedy. And a risky, daring romantic comedy in a way that is still, I think, not fully appreciated the way it should be.
Yeah, I agree.
You know, Nia Vardalos made the biggest rom-com of all time after nothing a one-woman show in LA, you know, and get, even when Tom Hanks and Rita Wilson got behind her movie, they couldn't sell it to a studio. And a locked movie, like, you know, it wasn't even here's a script. It was it was this huge crowd-pleasing hit, and she believed in it, and they pulled it off. You know, there really was, like, for the people who doubted this genre, which has literally always happened, they look like idiots over and over again in this book.
Yeah. Well, and I think that's one thing that's interesting, especially like going through, is it's like, you know, it's like touted as this like women's genre or whatever. And like, you kind of see that through with like focusing on like career women. Like, I mean, I'm never going to get over Julia Roberts as a 28-year-old food critic who has to marry someone by the time she turns 28 because she's like dead. But like whatever. But it's interesting as you like read all of this, and it's all of these very successful, great, cool women. And then you get to Judd Apatow, and then it's a bunch of like dudes who don't have bed frames. You know, I think that's like kind of an interesting way. And I have no disrespect to Judd Apatow, but like I think it is an interesting way that maybe it was like trying to market it like differently. Was that something that you felt like you noticed while you were kind of like going through, like it was a way to like make it more palatable to dudes or something? Yeah,
I think the trick with those rom-coms is they just didn't identify them as rom-coms, honestly.
Yeah,
it was they totally are. I mean, both 40-Year-Old Virgin and Knocked Up are super traditional rom-coms in structure.
Yeah.
And the main arc is about a dude getting his shit together and then, you know, being worthy of this woman that he's met. Like that's the whole movie for both of those movies. Not coincidentally, and Judd Apatow would be the first to say it, that is also his real life arc. Like he really relates to these stories he's telling. I think in terms of the marketing and in terms of trying to open the genre up, and you know, in ways that are a little frustrating to me, because it implies that the older movies were just for women, which they totally weren't. But I do think that was in the end the studio's big trick, that we're not going to call it a romantic comedy. We're going to call it a, you know, same for Wedding Crashers, same for, you know, a lot of movies that came out in this era, or everything Dane Cook was doing. They just sold it as a big raunchy comedy and hoped for the best.
Yeah, I mean, no one needs a Dane Cook anything.
Well, they made 3.
I my brain doesn't recognize that personally. But one thing I really want to hear your thoughts on is you get a little bit into 500 Days of Summer, which I think obviously is a very trepidatious film for many. Like, I think like I watched it like, you know, the first time around, like I think I was like post college or something. I was like, oh my God, I love this movie. And now I think like Joseph Gordon-Levitt is like nice guy, a bane on the existence of womankind. You know, I think that movie's aged very poorly. It's like very much reminds me of like Seth from the OC, who I think has also ruined a lot of lives. You know, you get into it very briefly, but at the same time, it was like very, very popular and really did take a hold, like I think, for a very specific demographic of people. You know, what are your kind of thoughts, and why wasn't it something that you decided to not include?
I think that's an interesting movie worth talking about. I disagree with your appraisal of it. I think that movie is quite aware that that character is toxic. I think maybe it's almost like the Joker of rom-coms, where it's been a little misinterpreted by the people who watch it and think he's so romantic and she sucks. And I think the movie is actually pretty cogent. It's a little easy on him because it's got that brutal beat at the end where he meets a woman named Autumn and everything's going to be okay. But like, Summer really calls him out in that final scene, and she's entirely accurate. She has been totally fair with him. She has not misled him for a single moment in the movie. And I think the movie is essentially on her side. And she meets someone else who we never even really know anything about, and she falls in love with that guy. And that would be an interesting movie. I think it's the point of view is what makes that a complicated movie to unpack, because I'm not sure our protagonist is supposed to be sympathetic. And maybe Joseph Gordon-Levitt's a little too likable. Maybe the filmmaking lets him off a little easy. But I do think that is a more complicated movie than toxic guy gets screwed over and then moves on.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think we have something else to argue about. So How to Lose a Guy in 10 Days, I think is perfect.
Okay.
And I don't know if you would agree with that, considering your chapter on it.
I would not call it perfect, but I do like it. I'm surprised you found that chapter so negative. What I would say about that movie in two parts, I think that movie is so ridiculously contrived in the basic premise of both of them simultaneously having bets that require a 10-day time period. But I would also say that movie is doing that completely deliberately and is stylish enough that like I wouldn't say that's a criticism. I would say there are other movies with similar contrivances that don't succeed in the way that I think that one does, because that one is really ultimately like a throwback to like workplace battle of the sexes comedies. You know, it's doing something very stylish on purpose. I think I hate the ending, which may be where you picked up. I find the ending, that's one that I find toxic, where she abandons her dream job interview in Washington, D.C. in order to stay with Matthew McConaughey, even though she was going to be back in a week. I can't quite parse the arc there right at the end. And it's because they wanted to do a big chase on the Brooklyn Bridge. It's around, there's a reason this stuff. But to me, that doesn't land. Until then, I think it's pretty good.
Hey, maybe he was just trying to save her from a life of living in DC.
Wow. Right? Looking like a true New Yorker, Kerensa.
I'm just saying, but one thing I do think, despite your feelings that I did disagree with, because Kate Hudson in that yellow dress, Catherine Hahn, I think you talk about a lot, and finally is getting her larger due.
Yep.
We love to see it. You bring back, I think that comes back to, which you bring up a lot, is like a lot of these go back to that whole like screwball comedies and like things in the 50s. Like I see How to Lose a Guy in 10 Days seems like very like kind of spiritual, like sister or whatever to like a Rock Hudson, Doris Day sort of thing. I also like a Down with Love, which is a wonderful film.
No, I completely agree with you. And if it's not clear at the start of the movie, when you've got Catherine Hahn pretending to be a therapist, when you've got this comedy of errors at the Diamond Party where where everyone gets confused about who knows what, and like the movie is extremely leaning into these kind of hyper stylized old rom-com tropes, and I think it's great. That is not a movie that I'm super critical of. So it's interesting that you read it that way. I'll have to read it and see what you think.
Well, I mean, and I love that you bring like that, like, because you do show the threads of like, what you don't even necessarily touch on in this, because you're obviously touching on a very specific period of time, but you do bring it back to like these kind of like Doris Day, Rock Hudson, like all of these kind of, was that something also like, obviously it doesn't make it into this book, but was that something you also like researched just in terms of preparation?
Yeah, I mean, I did a ton of research on that. The main reason it's not in the book is just because, this book is ultimately based largely on interviews. And, I picked a 30-year time period where even the early movies I cover, I couldn't get some of the dream interviews I would have had. Like, obviously, Nora Ephron was not around for me to talk to. Obviously, Marshall had passed, so I couldn't talk to him about Pretty Woman. Like, part of the reason to kind of situate it, in addition to just wanting to cover the modern era, was I picked a bunch of movies where I knew there were people I could talk to. But it didn't mean I just love rom-coms, and I'd seen a lot of the movies that I wanted to cover. So, so the older movies in there came up in plenty in conversation just by virtue of those movies led to the movies I was talking about. So that's mostly how they came in, just in background and context.
Yeah. And do you have a ballpark of like how many movies you ended up watching, whether or not they made it into the book?
It's hundreds. It's and a lot of them, if they don't come up in a single sentence. But if you're going to do a history of a genre, you really do need to
be
on the genre, and even if it's not something that necessarily directly informs what you write, like, it's in your brain somewhere. It gives you some context for what was happening in the genre. So, and more often than not, even the ones I didn't like as much, there were only a few that I was like, this is truly difficult for me to watch. Even a bad rom-com is pretty good. It's like pizza.
Yeah, I gotta ask, like, were there things that you revisited that like you haven't seen in a while? Like, what held up and what maybe didn't hold up?
Yeah, I was delighted, especially for most of the movies that I was covering in the book. I found held up well, or I discovered new things about them. Like, I knew I liked My Best Friend's Wedding. Revisiting it, I was like, this is really good, and like much riskier than I realized. There was stuff I thought I liked that didn't hold up as well. It didn't mean it was bad. It was bad. I found High Fidelity, to the John Cusack High Fidelity, a little harder to watch than I expected. It's another one where I think it's a movie that really is very good at interrogating what John Cusack's character is doing, but then it lets him off the hook at the end a little bit. He has the smallest modicum of growth, largely based on discovering that Catherine Zeta-Jones is repulsive, which feels like sort of a weird moment of character. And then
ones that never happened to anyone before.
And then he just kind of apologizes to his ex-girlfriend a little bit and says he needs to be less selfish, and then they're together again. And the movie ends with him doing a monologue saying he's going to think about her more, but it's like, it's not much of a journey you've been on, man. Like, yeah, it feels like maybe the movie should have started here with you trying to be a little better of a person. To a degree, that's what that movie is trying to do. But I think that was I was probably, 15 when I saw that for the first time. That's probably a good movie for a 15-year-old trying to figure out what dating was all about. I'm not sure I related to it as much revisiting it for the book.
Yeah. Well, like, what are some rom-com characters that you like historically feel like you relate to? Like, I know I feel like I watched Bridget Jones. I'm just drinking wine and like my apartment alone often. So I very much relate to her.
Yeah. That's, the Cusackian figure, which is something I get into in the book a little bit, is certainly like, I think a lot of people like me who like music and books, like latch onto that, like, oh, he's kind of nerdy, but like he's also cool and soulful, and like kind of that's something you kind of hope to be. I would love to be Tom Hanks in anything ever. even when he's kind of a jerk and You've Got Mail, there's just that.
I think that I don't think You've Got Mail holds up.
Yeah, it's not my favorite, if I'm being honest. I know that may earn me some trouble in the chat, so I apologize for the You've Got Mail fans out there. I think that's the least of the trilogy of those Nora Ephron movies. But I do think there's something to just the way that he plays any character. I mean, there's a reason he's Tom Hanks, America's most beloved actor. We'd all like to have that warmth and that twinkle.
Yeah. Well, and like you mentioned, we're getting like a bunch of rom-coms this year, which is very exciting. But you write about Crazy Rich Asians in here, which I think like kind of goes back to a lot of things we've talked about, is like there's not a ton of diversity in the genre, and that's still changing. But that was Crazy Rich Asians was such a spectacle, and it was such a huge thing and it made so much money, and it was just so delightful to see, and just gorgeously directed and looked amazing, and it was just awesome. Like we got Henry Golding out of it. Like it was just like, I mean, Gemma Chan, like that perfect symmetrical face. I would die for that woman, you know, like, I mean, there's just so much great stuff happening with it. And then it's been sort of crickets ever since. And that felt like such a huge, like, turning point for the genre. And I'm sure obviously there's so much that has happened in between that and now, like, obviously with COVID and stuff, but like, I think it feels like such a missed opportunity that we still haven't heard much about in terms of like if the sequel's happening or what have you. And it just seems like, it just sort of like feels like bleh. Like it was like such a huge like turning point for the genre to hopefully have it be more diverse and get to tell like more diverse stories. And like there were so many parts of it that like made, like, it felt like a Busby Berkeley musical in a lot of senses, which I think like John Chu did also with like In the Heights too. You know, I was just wondering like what you think about that, and like, again, like, is this because like mid-budget movies have sort of, I just find it like inexplainable that this thing that felt like such a huge thing, cultural moment, has just sort of like disappeared.
But I agree, and it's, I mean, in terms of all the other things that movie does so well, it was a giant coming out party again for studio rom-coms.
Yeah.
And a giant advertisement for the theatrical experience. I mean, talk about, you want a rom-com, you need to see big. That movie is just the locations. It's just so gorgeous on a big screen. So I agree that that's a missed opportunity. I dug into this a little in the reporting. It's a little tricky to parse exactly what happened there, but Adele Lim, the co-screenwriter, left rather acrimonious.
That whole thing is sorry.
It's all in the book, so I won't get into all the complicated details, but basically she was not being adequately compensated for the sequels. I have the sense that they're kind of figuring out what the sequels are. I mean, there are books they can draw from, so it's not like they have no idea what the plot would be, and they even tease kind of the romance for the sequel with
her and Harry.
So you can see where it should be going, but it just kind of feels like they maybe weren't even ready for, like the sequel should have been in production immediately after that.
Exactly.
Normally that's what they would do. I hope they haven't waited too long, because another thing I get into in the book is, to go with Warner Brothers, they turned down a 3-picture deal from Netflix, where Netflix would have produced them all back to back to back, and Netflix wanted it bad. This was like Netflix making a huge bid to make this a whole franchise, and I guarantee that if Netflix was at the helm, we'd have had all of them by now.
And I mean, I think like probably another thing is all these people are like Constance Wu, like Awkwafina, like all these people are very, very big stars.
Snake Eyes now.
Yeah, I mean,
G.I. Joe movie.
Well, he's going to be in Persuasion, which we're very excited about.
That's true.
But I mean, it just feels like obviously, and it is crazy because that wasn't even that long ago. And like we've talked about, the landscape has already changed so much. It's like if those had been released on Netflix, you know, and I think that kind of goes into like, where do you feel like the genre is going? Like you mentioned, again, we're getting a lot of stuff coming out this year. But like, what does the future look like for it? Because that was like this splashy thing, and I don't think. I mean, maybe The Lost City will kind of give us that. But and don't get me wrong, I love a Sandy moment, but like we've had many Sandy moments. Like we need something else. You know, what do you?
I'm still optimistic. I mean, obviously, it's so hard to predict. I mean, on top of Hollywood just being a very like unconventional, unpredictable industry, COVID has just thrown so many productions off the rails. In some ways, I feel like that should help rom-coms, because something you can do on a smaller scale might look uniquely appealing. But I'm still optimistic about the ones we got this year. We haven't even talked about Bros, the Billy Eichner rom-com.
I'm very excited about that.
You know, amazing that, you know, Billy Eichner is doing a rom-com about 2 gay men, and all of the supporting characters are played by LGBTQ actors, even the ones who are not playing LGBTQ characters. Like it's a big step forward for a studio rom-com.
And we're also going to get, like, I think Joel Kim Booster's like Fire Island film too, which I'm very excited about.
So I actually think there's a fair amount of work happening in the genre now, and that's not even talking about like the streamers just kind of continuing to gun them out the way they have. You know, what Netflix put out around Christmas alone is like that was more than enough rom-coms to watch in a month.
I mean, get ready for maybe Lindsay Lohan's comeback.
Yeah, there you go. That's another one. I feel like stuff is happening. It's hard to say what's going to hit and what's not, and I hope we don't have a series of flops that sort of lead the genre down into a tailspin.
Yeah. Well, if you wanted to give like racks, like, I mean, what are some rom-coms, like recent ones that you don't necessarily write about that are things that you would recommend to people to watch that maybe that haven't been on their radar?
Yeah, I actually I was just working on something about this earlier today about basically rom-coms from the past 10 years that might have been off your radar a little bit. Stuff that, in this kind of dead era for the genre, I think there was actually a lot of cool stuff happening. So let me just pull a few of those. I really liked Sleeping with Other People. Jason Sudeikis, Alison Brie movie. I thought Plus One was great. Meyers. I thought that was just
my new crush.
And a real kind of rom-com in a more classic sense. It really felt to me like, especially with Jack Quaid being rom-com royalty, it sort of felt to me like a bit of a kind of Meg Ryan style. To go more off the beaten path, there's a really good, it's on HBO Max right now, really good anime rom-com called The Night is Short, Walk On Girl that I really like. Check that out. That's very, very weird and stylized, but I thought delightful. It's basically about a young woman who can drink more than anybody going on a bar crawl one night, and a guy on her, trying to work up the courage. So that's The Night is Short, Walk On Girl. Check that out. That's great.
That sounds awesome.
Yeah, I think you'd like it.
Okay, I'm going to need you to text me that title. Thank you.
I got you. Don't worry.
What else? Okay, well, I have to ask. Well, I think one of my favorite of the last is Juliet Naked. I wonder if you consider that a rom-com, though.
It's a good question. It's on the line because it's a little dramatic. I'm not. The drama might outweigh the com in that one. But I'll give it to you. It's really good. If you haven't seen Juliet Naked, people watching, I do really recommend that. That's terrific.
Yeah, Rose Byrne, Ethan Hawke playing.
Ethan Hawke, what a hunk!
Late Ethan Hawke has really changed my viewpoint on Ethan Hawke.
Yeah.
Well, Scott, I mean, I'm so proud of you. I'm so excited that you look at you birthed a book and you're a father. Like you're a father of two different things, a child and
year, no question. Yeah.
Year for you. So what can we expect from you next?
That's a good question. I mean, for starters, you can keep reading me. I publish criticism and profiles and that kind of thing pretty regularly at Vulture and at GQ. I'm certainly interested in writing a second book. I don't know what that would look like yet, but I would say watch this space, and I hope I will have something cool to announce sooner rather than later.
Yeah. Well, I think we are ready for some questions from the audience, if we could get some of those.
Mm-hmm.
Sure. There's Nikos in Honolulu said, do you write about Splash, which is a key film in the oeuvre of Hanks and Howard?
Yeah. It doesn't come up much in the book because it's outside of the time period I covered, but it is a movie I love.
Okay. And how inclusive is your definition of rom-com? Does the Judd Apatow era of bro-coms count as rom-coms in disguise?
Yes, I do include the Judd Apatow movies. One of the first things I had to do in the book was come up with a working definition of rom-coms, and I quickly realized how wrong people get that. Like it drove me crazy to see all these old stories about, The Devil Wears Prada, the best rom-com of the year, and it's like, that is not a romantic comedy. That is the arc of that story is about her and Meryl Streep. And there is a romantic subplot that is bad, and the movie is worse every time Adrian Grenier is on screen. So for my working definition of basically how I could figure out if something was a rom-com or not, it basically came down to two things. Does it make you laugh more than it makes you cry? And if you pulled the romantic storyline out of this movie, would there still be a movie, or does the whole thing fall apart? And if the answer to that was yes, then I decided it was a rom-com, that for my purposes.
I think you may have kind of covered this, but many films don't age well. Is there a rom-com that you think was maybe ahead of its time that has more or less been vindicated over time?
Oh, that's an interesting question. Wow, ahead of its time. What it makes me think about is the movies that were unfairly criticized as bad protagonists. Oh, hi, Kevin. Yeah, saving face. There you go. I was going to mention there was so much criticism of the Bridget Jones character at the time. When the book went, went the columns, then the book, then the movie came out. There was so much like, this is a bad representation. And I actually think it was a very heartfelt and forward-thinking and compassionate look at singledom in that era. And so I think that's aged very well to me. That the movie, I think that movie was ahead of the curve on that.
Here's another good question. Who is the Cary Grant of the last quarter century?
Oh,
wow! I mean, can there be another? I don't know. I'm not sure there's any actor I can elevate to that tier. I mean, if you're looking for someone that suave, Henry Golding is pretty suave. It's a pretty small sample size we're working with, but there's that swoon factor. It's the first thing that came to mind.
I mean, even in Last Christmas.
Sure, another which I think is underrated.
I cried a lot.
That's another one I would recommend if you're in the mood for a Christmas rom-com that I think didn't quite get its due.
Okay, and there's another question about TV sitcoms. Do sitcoms like Friends and How I Met Your Mother, they count as serialized TV rom-coms?
Yeah, I think part of it is it's harder to define, especially with the weird system that I came up with for defining a rom-com. It's harder because sitcoms just kind of by definition have to contain multitudes. If a show is going to run for 8 years, it's going to do a lot of things. But How I Met Your Mother, I think, definitely does, because it is so framed as a rom-com. If you don't have that framing device of How I Met Your Mother and every episode opening with him telling the kids a story, that's about as classic rom-com as you're going to get in terms of kind of situating the whole thing within the context of a love story, even a love story that, they clearly had to stretch all out of proportion to make that show continue so long. Like the framework may have eventually broken, but it was there. Friends, I think, is more complicated. It has rom-com elements in it. I would think of it as more of like a hangout sitcom, because as much as the love story was a big part of what people enjoyed about the show, I think the show's casting a wider net than, especially as it keeps kind of swapping the different pairings. I'm not sure it's quite down the middle of the plate in that rom-com style.
Okay, and we don't have any other questions right now, but I kind of want to. I'm just curious personally. Where are we going to be on Love Actually in another 10 years?
Well, what I can guarantee you is that people will be arguing about it every Christmas forever. I don't think we're any closer to solving the debate of Love Actually as a masterpiece or terrible. But I guarantee you will find plenty of arguments on both sides. There's a chapter on it in the book. I'm somewhere in the middle. I think there is stuff that is truly like wonderful about that movie. I think there is stuff that is very bad and toxic and was bad at the time and has aged worse. So it's a really interesting movie to unpack, because of course, if you're going to put 11 rom-coms in a rom-com, if you're going to do a bunch of mini ones, like some are going to hit harder than others. And I think that movie is an interesting microcosm in terms of, if you're going to try to tell every kind of love story, weird stuff is going to come out about how we date and how we fall in love. And that's what happened.
Wait, well, what's your favorite little vignette from Love Actually then?
Well, the best stuff is the Emma Thompson stuff for sure. Even though it's the most depressing stuff. I don't know if that reflects. It may not even be fair. I mean, that movie is a rom-com. It may not be fair to call that, because it's all about kind of having to muddle through a marriage that is not what you thought it was. But her performance is incredible. It's such a good performance. In particular, when she listens to the Joni Mitchell CD, and it's just it is just wordless acting. Richard Curtis talks about how the script, just like, she goes up and listens to Joni Mitchell and cries, and she pulled a really wrenching performance where you watch her go through a whole emotional process mentally and then go back downstairs and put a face on for the kids. Like it's amazing. It's really a wonderful performance.
What do you think is the one that's aged the worst out of it?
Boy, do I hate the cards at the door. It's probably the most iconic image from the movie, but everything about it is just like toxic and creepy, and also has unanswered questions, like why no one objects to the fact that his friend shot a wedding video that is just Keira Knightley's face, and no one seems to think that's weird. And that Richard Curtis, it comes up in the book where Richard Curtis was trying to figure out which grand gesture to do for that scene and polled the women in the office about which one was the least creepy. And that was the one that won, the one that he preferred, or he may not have preferred, but another one that was at least in strong contention was him filling the whole courtyard with roses, which I find even more disturbing than the cards. The cards at least are a little kind of understated and homemade, but I just the idea that we're supposed to find it romantic that this dude has been like quietly creeping on his best friend's wife, and that, like, you know, him getting his little triumphant moment there. I don't care for any of that.
You don't like a grand gesture?
I love a grand gesture. I would prefer it not be against your best friend behind his back with his partner. There's something about that is not quite unpacked in that movie in the way that I would need it to be.
Yeah. Well, hopefully we don't get a Love Actually remake.
There's the little Richard Curtis sequel.
I did want to ask obviously the 4 Weddings and a Funeral, Red Nose one killed me, because obviously the union of Lily James and Alicia Vikander was very disrespectful and gay baiting to some of us, because Alicia Vikander was in a tuxedo, and that just seems a lot.
I should, for people who haven't seen these who are watching, Richard Curtis, for his charity Red Nose Day, has done kind of short sequels reuniting a lot of the actors to 4 Weddings and a Funeral and Love Actually. And if you like those movies, or even if you just find those movies interesting, those really are worth watching. I have no idea if they count as canon. I'm not sure if you can kind of bring them into your whole understanding of those movies, but it's fun to see those actors playing those characters and to kind of see they're very kind of cheeky and self-aware, to the point that Richard Curtis is the first to acknowledge some of the failings of those movies and the stuff that hasn't aged very well. And that's kind of fun to watch in itself.
Well, Scott, do you have anything you'd like to leave the people with about rom-coms, love?
Yeah, I would say thanks for watching, and thanks so much to you for moderating and to Book Soup for hosting. This has just been a delight. And I would say that if you're a fan of rom-coms, and I assume that if you're watching this, you are, I think we're in a really exciting time for the genre. And so if you're one of the people who read all of those kind of death of the rom-com op-eds and got frustrated and wrung your hands like I did, I don't think it was ever true, but I also think we're on a real upswing for what's happening in the rom-com genre. So I just can't wait to watch a bunch more stuff. And that's a pretty good feeling after writing this book that I
It is a good feeling. And also, we've all read, with the existence of Love Actually, we'll get a yearly why I love Love Actually and why I hate Love Actually blog. So
at the very least, in the nuclear apocalypse, we will still be debating that.
Exactly. We're all going to be in our bomb shelters, but at least we'll still be debating Love Actually. So,
we're at the Prime Minister.
Well, everyone, since he's too modest to do it, everyone please click this middle button and buy Scott's wonderful book. It's so good, and it has so many fun, dishy details that you definitely need in your brain. And thank you to Book Soup. Thank you to Scott for writing a lovely book. And thank you all for joining us so much tonight.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you both. Thank you, Kerensa, for a great conversation. Scott, congratulations on the book. Thanks for doing this with us, your first book. And I look forward to meeting you all in person eventually, someday.
Can't wait. The Love Actually debate will continue.
I love it. There's so much. Just real quick, for people who may have joined us late, when this broadcast ends, it's going to save. It takes maybe about a minute. And then you'll be able to watch the broadcast from the archive all the way through from start to finish. Please share it with friends. And thank you all for being here, and have a wonderful evening.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.